says crime and incarceration rates for African Americans are 7 times those of white America. Which seems to me, if you quote a statistic like that, if you say incarceration and crime levels, black 7 times those of white, you come to one of 2 conclusions. One, something happened before the era we live in to make one group of people 7 times more likely to commit crimes, or that other group is just morally inferior.
New Haven thought that the test was unfair.
Why was it an unfair test? Because black Americans, none of them were in the top 19? Did that make it unfair per se? As for a case, let me give you the New York case where Sonia Sotomayor said New York had to extend voting rights to felons at Attica and the other prisons because there were so many African Americans there and so many Hispanics in there that not to give them the vote was represented a disparate impact of the law, even though the 14th Amendment says the states decide on who gets to vote. Lieutenant and captain, 4 of them were African American. Nobody would be looking at that test at all. That would have been just fine, but the very fact that African Americans didn't come in the top 19, that is why the test suddenly becomes suspect. Maybe the reason is the African American firefighters didn't study as hard. Maybe they didn't work as hard. Maybe they're not as bright. Maybe they're not doing as well on these exams. But to automatically assume that some kind of discrimination must occur simply because the test results bring in 18 white folks and 1 Hispanic, it seems to me is a rush to judgment.
Let me ask him. No one was assuming that. This following point that you certainly wouldn't use a multiple choice test as 60% of your decision, which New Haven does, and very few, if any, other jurisdictions do. The jurisdictions closest by weight the multiple choice part is only 25%.
Okay, here's the point. I think here's something everybody can understand. Are you arguing, Mr. Payton, are you arguing the opposite? You're arguing, Mr. Payton, that the very notion of a multiple choice objective test where you have to answer particular questions about specific questions of perhaps chemical fires, electrical fires, complicated things you have to answer. Are you saying by its nature a written test which involves multiple choice answers is in fact inherently unfair? It sounds like you're saying you shouldn't give too much weight to that. Well, why not? Why not?
If you were designing this test, I think you would change both the questions and its weighting. And I'm not saying you can't have a test. I'm saying that the test ought to be weighted appropriately, and that the most important thing you would want to know about who can be a leader is in an interview or some other assessment that would be much more focused on what you want in your captains and your lieutenants.
Sir, you seem to be saying this test came in with the wrong result, and we got to get ourselves a test that will come in with the result.
You just keep saying that over and over again, but I never said that.
Well, that's what it sounds like.
I said if you want to measure for leadership, measure for leadership.
Do you think the Supreme Court decided this correctly?
Let's go to what the Justice
We have many more minorities than African Americans who have been victims of very nasty discrimination, including Puerto Ricans and other Hispanics in this country. I don't think there's any question about how racism and discrimination, ethnic hostility have affected more than African Americans in this country.
All right, let me mention, Irish Americans have certainly been discriminated against for almost 100 years. We all remember No Irish Need Apply. Should Irish Americans be preferred in the Ivy League and get affirmative action and ethnic preferences?
You are making a slightly different point. This is not an affirmative action case. It's whether or not we can have a fair test.
Although this study was released this week in Los Angeles just today, it hasn't received much play in the news media, and the authors know why. They say it deals with a very delicate issue and some misunderstandings that ethnic group activists say must no longer be ignored.
Southern California, the most diverse region in the nation, a symphony of cultures and colors. But while there have been studies as to how whites relate to non-whites, this is the first survey that explores attitudes among the ethnic groups themselves.
1,100 interviews. It was a very scientific poll.
The poll, sponsored by the New America Media, indicates there are serious tensions and negative stereotypes among blacks, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. For example, a majority of African Americans and near majority of Hispanics saying they aren't treated with respect at Asian-run businesses. And a majority of African Americans believing Latino immigrants are taking jobs, housing, and political influence from blacks. And Hispanics and Asians, to a large degree, believe African Americans are more prone to crime. Those behind the study believe much of the problem is with ethnic media.
For example, in the Korean media specifies an assailant. Korean student assaulted by Hispanic. The Chinese media will cover one incident, African-American robber, will create a negative stereotype that just gets deeper and deeper.
As a rule, each of the ethnic groups trust whites more than they do each other, by wide margins. 61% of Hispanics would trust whites to do business with, only 3% trusting African Americans. A majority of Asian Americans would trust whites, only 3% trusting blacks, 7% Hispanics. Only 6% of blacks would prefer to do business with Asian Americans. And although less than half of African Americans believe that if you work hard you can succeed, a vast majority of immigrants, particularly Hispanics, Filipinos, and Vietnamese, believe in the American dream.
They are so tremendously committed to the notion that they can rebuild their lives, they can make a better life for their children.
Most polled believe race relations will get better over time. We'll have more on this issue on News Conference Sunday morning at 9:30 here on NBC4. Paul, Colleen.
All right, Conan, look forward to that.
It says crime and incarceration rates for African Americans are 7 times those of white America. Which seems to me, if you quote a statistic like that, if you say incarceration and crime levels, blacks 7 times those of whites, you come to one of two conclusions. One, something happened before the era we live in to make one group of people 7 times more likely to commit crimes, or that other group is just morally inferior.